Maria Santos walked through the front doors of the martial arts gym on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The building was old but well kept, with bright lights shining down on the main training area. She looked around at all the people gathered inside and felt very small. The gym was packed with more than 200 people who had come to watch the monthly fighting exhibition. Most of them were young men with big muscles and confident attitudes. They wore tank tops and shorts that showed off their athletic bodies. Their voices were loud as they talked about different fighting techniques and famous fighters they admired. Maria was 45 years old and looked like a regular mom from the neighborhood. She stood only 5 feet and 2 inches tall, which made her much shorter than most people in the room. Her brown hair had started turning gray at the temples, and she kept it pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a plain white t-shirt, ordinary blue jeans, and old white tennis shoes that needed to be replaced soon. Nothing about Maria suggested she belonged in this place. She carried a small black purse over her shoulder and moved slowly through the crowd. When bigger people walked past her, she stepped aside and waited for them to go by. She seemed nervous about taking up too much space or getting in anyone's way. The main fighting area was a large square mat surrounded by metal folding chairs. Most of the seats were already taken by excited spectators. Parents sat with their children in the front rows, pointing at the fighters and explaining what was happening. Behind them, serious martial arts fans leaned forward to study every movement and technique. Maria found an empty chair in the very back row where she hoped nobody would notice her. She sat down quietly and placed her purse on the floor beside her feet. Her hands rested in her lap as she looked around at all the activity happening in the gym. The walls were covered with colorful posters advertising upcoming tournaments and training classes. Photographs of local champions hung in frames, showing fighters holding up gold medals and championship belts. Motivational quotes about hard work and dedication were painted in large letters across the walls. Near the equipment area, several fighters were getting ready for their demonstrations. They stretched their muscles and practiced their moves while coaches gave them last-minute advice. The sound of heavy punching bags being hit echoed through the building, mixed with the quick footsteps of people moving around on the training mats. As the official demonstrations began, the crowd became more excited and loud. The first fighter was a young woman who specialized in kickboxing. She moved incredibly fast, throwing punches and kicks that cut through the air with sharp whooshing sounds. Her techniques were precise and powerful, making the audience clap and cheer after each combination. Next came 2 wrestlers who showed the crowd how to perform takedowns and ground fighting moves. Both men were heavily muscled and moved with explosive power. When they slammed each other onto the mat, the impact was so hard that it made a loud thudding sound that could be heard throughout the entire gym. Maria watched everything with careful attention. While other people in the audience sometimes looked at their phones or talked to their neighbors, she kept her eyes focused on the mat. Her face remained calm and neutral, but she seemed genuinely interested in what the fighters were doing. The energy in the room reached its highest point when Marcus Rodriguez stepped onto the mat for his demonstration. Marcus was known by his nickname, The Mountain, which he had earned through years of winning fights and competitions. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall and weighed about 250 pounds of solid muscle. Marcus dominated the space around him just by being there. His shoulders were so broad that people sitting behind him had trouble seeing past him. His arms were thick and powerful, covered in tattoos that told the story of his fighting career. He wore a tight black t-shirt that showed off his impressive physique. Before starting his demonstration, Marcus spent several minutes interacting with the crowd. He flexed his muscles for a group of teenage boys who asked him to show his strength. He signed autographs for young fans who looked up to him as a hero. Parents asked him to pose for pictures with their children, and he was happy to oblige with his characteristic confident smile. When Marcus finally began his fighting demonstration, he chose to display his most impressive and powerful techniques. He worked with another large and strong training partner to show various takedowns and throws. Each time he grabbed his partner and threw him to the ground, the impact created a loud crash that made the audience gasp with amazement and then burst into applause. Marcus followed up the throwing techniques with demonstrations of submission, holds, and ground control moves. His style was aggressive and overwhelming, designed to show complete physical dominance over his opponent. The crowd loved every minute of it, cheering loudly and calling out encouragement. After finishing his planned demonstration, Marcus stood in the center of the mat and began speaking to the audience. His voice was deep and powerful, easily reaching every person in the gym without needing any kind of microphone or sound system. He talked about the importance of being physically strong in martial arts. He explained how size and muscle mass could overcome fancy techniques when used the right way. Marcus described his intense training routine, which included lifting heavy weights and doing cardio exercises designed to build maximum strength and power. As Marcus continued talking to the crowd, his eyes began looking around the room for someone to help with his next demonstration. The gym instructors often included interactive segments where regular people from the audience could come up and experience basic martial arts techniques in a safe way. Marcus seemed to be searching for someone who would provide a good contrast to show off his impressive abilities. His gaze moved slowly across the faces of people in the audience, clearly looking for the right volunteer to help demonstrate his skills and knowledge. When his eyes finally stopped on Maria, sitting quietly by herself in the back row, a big smile appeared on his face. She was the perfect opposite of everything he represented as a fighter. Where he was huge, she was tiny. Where he was muscular and intimidating, she looked gentle and harmless. Where he loved being the center of attention, she seemed to prefer staying invisible. Marcus raised his large hand and pointed straight at Maria. Marcus pointed his thick finger directly at Maria and called out in his booming voice that filled every corner of the gym. "You there in the back row. Yes, you with the white shirt. How about helping me show everyone some basic self-defense moves?" All eyes in the gymnasium turned toward Maria. She felt her cheeks grow warm as more than 200 people suddenly focused their attention on her. Some people twisted around in their chairs to get a better look at who Marcus had chosen. Others leaned to the side to see past the person sitting in front of them. Maria hesitated for a moment, looking around as if hoping Marcus might be pointing at someone else nearby. But she was sitting alone, and there was no doubt about who he meant. She slowly raised her hand in a small wave to acknowledge that she understood he was talking to her. "Come on down here," Marcus said with a big grin spreading across his face. "Don't be shy. I promise I'll be extra gentle with you." The crowd began to murmur and whisper among themselves. Maria could hear fragments of conversations as people expressed their thoughts about what they were about to witness. "Oh no, this doesn't look good," said an older man sitting near the front. "Someone should stop this before she gets hurt," whispered a woman holding a young child. "This is going to be embarrassing," muttered a teenager to his friend. Maria stood up slowly from her chair and began walking toward the mat. Each step she took seemed to make the contrast between her and Marcus even more obvious. He stood in the center of the fighting area like a giant statue, his massive frame casting a shadow across half the mat. She looked tiny in comparison, like a child approaching an adult. As Maria got closer to the mat, Marcus began playing to the crowd even more. He flexed his biceps and made exaggerated motions to show off his size and strength. The audience laughed at his antics, but it was nervous laughter mixed with concern for what might happen to the small woman walking toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced like a circus ringmaster, "we have a very brave volunteer here today. Let's give her a big round of applause for her courage." The crowd clapped politely, but many people looked worried rather than excited. Some parents covered their children's eyes, not wanting them to see what they thought might be an accident waiting to happen. When Maria finally stepped onto the soft mat, the difference in their sizes became even more dramatic. Marcus towered over her like a mountain next to a small hill. His shoulders were twice as wide as hers, and his arms were thicker than her legs. He could probably have picked her up with one hand without much effort. The gym instructor, a middle-aged man named Coach Thompson, approached them with obvious concern on his face. He had been running these exhibitions for many years and had never seen such a mismatched pairing between a volunteer and a demonstrator. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Coach Thompson asked Maria quietly, leaning down so only she could hear him. "We can easily find someone else to help with the demonstration. There's no pressure at all." Marcus overheard the conversation and laughed loudly. "Come on, Coach. Don't embarrass the lady by suggesting she can't handle a little Demonstration. I told everyone I'd be gentle. What's the worst that could happen? More laughter rippled through the crowd, but it still had an uncomfortable edge to it. Many people were genuinely worried about Maria's safety, even though Marcus kept promising to be careful with her. Maybe she took a self-defense class at the community center. Marcus continued, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. She can show us some of those moves they teach soccer moms. You know, how to use your car keys as a weapon or how to scream really loud. The audience laughed again, this time more genuinely amused by Marcus's jokes. Some people began to relax, thinking that maybe this would just be a funny demonstration rather than something dangerous. Maria stood quietly in the center of the mat, listening to all the comments and laughter around her. Her face remained calm and peaceful, showing no signs of anger or embarrassment despite all the jokes being made at her expense. She seemed almost meditative, as if she was focusing on something internal rather than paying attention to the mockery. Marcus began walking around Maria in a slow circle, like a predator studying its prey. He continued his commentary for the audience's entertainment, pointing out their obvious physical differences and making predictions about how the demonstration would go. Look at this size difference, folks, he said, gesturing dramatically with his large hands. I probably weigh twice as much as she does. My reach is at least a foot longer than hers. This is going to be a perfect example of why size matters. In a real confrontation, he stopped directly in front of Maria and looked down at her with an amused expression. So tell me, what's your fighting experience? Have you ever been in a martial arts gym before today? Do you watch those action movies where tiny people beat up big guys and think that stuff actually works in real life? Maria looked up at him, with steady, calm eyes, but didn't respond to his questions. Her silence seemed to amuse Marcus even more, and he turned back to the crowd with an even bigger smile. Strong, silent type, he announced. I like that. Very mysterious. Maybe she's saving all her energy for our demonstration. Coach Thompson tried one more time to offer Maria an easy way out of the situation. Really, we can do this demonstration with one of our regular students if you'd prefer to just watch from your seat. There's absolutely no shame in that. But before Maria could respond, Marcus jumped in again. No way, Coach. The lady came down here to participate, and we're going to give her exactly what she asked for. Besides, this will be educational for everyone. They'll see how real size and strength advantages work in the real world. Marcus began shadowboxing and stretching his muscles, putting on a show for the crowd while he waited for the demonstration to officially begin. He threw slow-motion punches at the air and practiced some basic takedown movements, his massive frame moving with surprising grace and speed. The audience watched his warm-up routine with growing appreciation for his athletic abilities. Even people who had been worried about Maria began to get caught up in Marcus's impressive display of power and technique. Maria continued to stand quietly in the center of the mat, her hands relaxed at her sides and her breathing slow and steady. While everyone else's attention was focused on Marcus and his showboating, a few observant people in the crowd began to notice something different about the way she carried herself. Her posture was perfectly balanced, with her weight evenly distributed on both feet. Her shoulders were relaxed but ready, and her eyes tracked Marcus's movements with a level of focus that seemed unusual for someone who was supposedly inexperienced in martial arts. But most people were too distracted by Marcus's performance to notice these subtle details about Maria's demeanor and positioning. Coach Thompson clapped his hands together to get everyone's attention and announced that the demonstration was about to begin. The crowd settled down and leaned forward in their seats, eager to see what would happen between the giant fighter and the small woman on the mat. All right, everyone, Coach Thompson said in his clear instructor voice. We're going to demonstrate some basic defensive positioning. Marcus will attempt a simple takedown, and our volunteer will practice staying balanced and avoiding being grabbed. Marcus stretched his neck from side to side and cracked his knuckles loudly. The sound echoed through the quiet gymnasium like small firecrackers going off. He looked down at Maria with a confident smile that suggested this would be the easiest demonstration he had ever done. Don't worry, little lady, Marcus said in a voice loud enough for the entire audience to hear. I'm going to move real slow so you can see everything coming. Just try your best to stay on your feet. Most beginners fall down right away, and that's perfectly normal. The crowd chuckled nervously at his comment. Many people still looked concerned about what they were about to witness, but Marcus's promise to go slowly made them feel slightly better about the situation. Marcus positioned himself about 3 feet away from Maria and raised his hands in front of him. His massive arms looked like tree branches as he prepared to reach forward and grab her shoulders for what should have been a basic, gentle takedown demonstration. "Here I come," Marcus announced, taking his first step toward Maria. "Remember, don't panic when I grab you. Just let it happen and try to learn something." But as Marcus moved forward to make contact, something completely unexpected occurred. Maria shifted her weight in such a subtle way that it was almost invisible to most people watching. She didn't take a big step or make any dramatic movements. Instead, she seemed to simply melt away from where Marcus thought she would be. Marcus's large hands reached forward to grab Maria's shoulders, but somehow they found nothing but empty air. She had been standing right in front of him just a moment before, but now she was slightly to his left side, just out of his reach. Marcus looked confused but not worried yet. He figured he had simply misjudged the distance in his effort to be gentle and slow for the demonstration. He adjusted his position and tried again, this time reaching a little further forward. "Hold still now," Marcus said with a slight laugh. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." But once again, Maria seemed to flow away from his grasp, like water moving around a rock. This time she ended up on his right side, still close enough that it looked like he should have been able to grab her easily, but somehow completely out of his reach. The crowd began to murmur quietly among themselves. People were starting to notice that something unusual was happening, even though they couldn't quite figure out what it was. Marcus was clearly trying to grab his volunteer, but he kept missing her despite his size advantage and her apparent lack of movement. Marcus's confident smile began to fade slightly. He was a skilled martial artist with years of experience, and he should have been able to complete a simple demonstration grab without any problems. The fact that he was having difficulty with such a basic technique was starting to make him feel embarrassed. "Okay, let's try this again," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its playful tone. "Just stand still and let me demonstrate the proper way to defend against a grab." For his third attempt, Marcus decided to use a little more speed and force. He wasn't trying to hurt Maria, but he wanted to make sure he could actually complete the demonstration that the audience was expecting to see. This time, when Marcus reached forward, Maria made a slightly more noticeable movement. She stepped to her right side in a smooth, flowing motion that looked almost like dancing. As she moved, she lightly touched Marcus's extended arm with just her fingertips. The touch was so gentle that it looked completely harmless, but something strange happened to Marcus as soon as she made contact. His forward momentum seemed to increase on its own, and he found himself stumbling forward much faster than he had intended. Marcus had to take several quick steps to keep from falling face first onto the mat. His athletic reflexes saved him from a complete tumble, but he ended up bent over and off balance, looking nothing like the confident fighter he had been just moments before. The audience gasped collectively as they watched the massive man nearly fall down, while the small woman remained perfectly balanced and composed. Several people sat up straighter in their seats, suddenly paying much closer attention to what was happening on the mat. "What just happened?" someone whispered from the front row. "How did she do that?" asked another spectator. Maria stood calmly. In the center of the mat, her hands relaxed at her sides and her breathing still slow and steady. She looked exactly the same as she had when she first stepped onto the mat, showing no signs of effort or excitement despite what had just occurred. Marcus straightened up and turned around to face Maria again. His face was slightly red and there was a puzzled expression in his eyes. He had been doing martial arts demonstrations for many years, and he had never experienced anything quite like what had just happened. "That was interesting," Marcus said, trying to sound casual even though his voice betrayed some confusion. "You've got some natural movement ability. Most people would have just stood there and let me grab them." But as Marcus prepared for another attempt, he noticed something that made him pause. Maria's posture had changed in a way that was almost impossible to describe. She still looked relaxed and peaceful, but there was something different about how she was standing and the way she was looking at him. Her feet were positioned perfectly under her center of gravity. Her shoulders were loose but ready for movement. Most importantly, Her eyes were tracking his every movement with a level of focus and awareness that didn't match her appearance as an inexperienced volunteer. Marcus had seen that look before in the eyes of experienced fighters, but surely that couldn't be what he was seeing now. This was just a regular woman from the audience who had never been in a martial arts gym before. The crowd had grown completely quiet now, sensing that something unusual was happening, even though most of them couldn't identify exactly what it was. The nervous laughter and casual conversations had stopped, replaced by an atmosphere of focused attention and growing anticipation. Marcus decided to try one more time, but now he was genuinely focused on completing the technique, rather than just putting on a show for the audience. Marcus decided he needed to get serious about completing this demonstration. His reputation was on the line, and people were starting to wonder why he was having so much trouble with a simple grab. He rolled his shoulders back and took a deep breath, preparing to use more of his actual strength and speed. "All right, let's finish this demonstration properly," Marcus announced to the crowd, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Sometimes you need to be a little more decisive in these situations. The audience sensed the change in Marcus's tone and attitude. The playful atmosphere from earlier was completely gone, replaced by a tension that made everyone sit up straighter in their chairs. Parents instinctively moved their children closer to them, sensing that things were about to become more intense. Marcus positioned himself directly in front of Maria and stared down at her with focused determination. This time he wasn't going to play around or move slowly for the sake of the demonstration. He was going to grab her shoulders with enough force and speed to ensure success. Without warning, Marcus lunged forward with real intent. His massive frame moved with surprising speed as he reached out with both hands to secure a firm grip on Maria's shoulders. His movement was no longer the gentle demonstration grab he had promised earlier, but the aggressive takedown attempt of an experienced fighter. What happened next would be talked about in martial arts circles for years to come. Maria moved like flowing water around a stone. As Marcus committed fully to his forward lunge, she stepped to her right side with a motion so smooth and effortless that it looked like she was dancing rather than defending herself. At the same time, she reached out and touched Marcus's left wrist with just 2 fingers of her right hand. The touch was incredibly light, barely more pressure than a butterfly landing on a flower, but the effect on Marcus was immediate and dramatic. His own momentum, combined with the subtle guidance from Maria's fingertips, sent him stumbling forward with twice the speed he had intended. Marcus found himself charging across the mat completely out of control. His feet scrambled to keep up with his upper body, and his arms windmilled frantically as he tried to regain his balance. The powerful fighter who had been dominating the demonstration just moments before now looked like a beginner who had never learned how to walk properly. The crowd gasped in unison as they watched the huge man nearly crash into the wall at the far end of the mat. Only his natural athletic ability saved him from a complete disaster, allowing him to catch himself and turn around before he fell down completely. When Marcus spun back to face Maria, his face was red with embarrassment and confusion. Sweat was already forming on his forehead despite the fact that he had barely exerted himself physically. His breathing was heavier than it should have been, and his confident demeanor had evaporated entirely. "How did you do that?" Marcus asked, genuinely bewildered by what had just happened to him. Maria didn't answer his question. Instead, she simply stood in the center of the mat with the same calm, peaceful expression she had worn since stepping onto the fighting surface. Her hands hung relaxed at her sides, and her breathing remained slow and steady as if nothing unusual had occurred. Marcus decided to try a different approach. Instead of rushing straight forward, he began to circle around Maria like a wrestler, looking for an opening. He moved carefully, keeping his hands up and his weight balanced, trying to find an angle where he could successfully grab her without falling into another trap. But no matter which direction Marcus approached from, Maria seemed to anticipate his movement before he made it. When he stepped to his left, she was already flowing to her right. When he tried to fake in one direction and grab from another, she moved as if she could read his mind. The most remarkable thing was that Maria never looked rushed or defensive. She didn't back away from Marcus or try to avoid the confrontation. Instead, she moved just enough to stay out of his reach while remaining close enough that it seemed like he should be able to grab her at any moment. Marcus grew more frustrated. With each failed attempt, his movements became less controlled and more desperate as he tried to use his size and strength advantages. But every time he committed to a grab or a takedown attempt, Maria would make a tiny adjustment that sent him stumbling past her, or left him grasping at empty air. The crowd watched in amazed silence as the small woman continued to make the huge fighter look clumsy and inexperienced. People who had been worried about her safety just minutes before were now watching in fascination as she demonstrated a level of movement control that none of them had ever seen before. After several more failed attempts, Marcus stopped trying to grab Maria and just stood still, breathing heavily from his exertion and frustration. He looked around at the silent crowd, then back at the woman who had somehow taken complete control of their demonstration without appearing to do anything aggressive or forceful. "I don't understand what's happening here," Marcus admitted, his voice showing genuine respect for the first time since the demonstration had begun. "You're doing something I've never experienced before." Maria smiled slightly and took a small step back, giving Marcus space to recover his composure. The movement was gentle and non-threatening, but it also clearly demonstrated that she had been controlling the distance and timing of their entire interaction from the very beginning. The audience remained completely quiet, sensing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary but not quite understanding what it was. The woman they had felt sorry for just a few minutes earlier had somehow turned the tables on one of the most skilled fighters any of them had ever seen. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at Maria with a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and growing admiration. He was beginning to realize that his volunteer was not at all what she had appeared to be when she first walked onto the mat. Coach Thompson stepped forward, his own expression showing amazement at what he had just witnessed. As someone who had been teaching martial arts for over 20 years, he recognized that he was seeing something very special, even if he couldn't quite identify what it was. The demonstration had become something completely different from what anyone had expected, and everyone in the gymnasium sensed that they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of what martial arts could really accomplish. The gymnasium remained completely silent as Marcus stood in the center of the mat, breathing heavily and looking at Maria with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. His earlier arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by genuine curiosity about what he had just experienced. "I need to know," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "What just happened here? I've been training for 15 years, and I've never felt anything like that before. You barely touched me, but somehow you controlled everything I did." Maria looked up at the much larger man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. For the first time since stepping onto the mat, she spoke in a clear, confident voice that surprised everyone who heard it. 32 years of training," she said simply. "I started learning Jiu-Jitsu when I was 13 years old in Brazil. My grandfather was one of the original students of the Gracie family." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Several people in the audience actually stood up from their chairs, unable to believe what they had just heard. Others leaned forward with their mouths open, trying to process the incredible revelation. Coach Thompson's jaw dropped as the pieces suddenly fell into place in his mind. He stared at Maria with wide eyes, his face showing a mixture of amazement and embarrassment at not recognizing who she was. "You're Maria Santos," Coach Thompson said in a voice filled with awe. "You're the Maria Santos who won the World Championships 3 times in the 1990s. I have your instructional videos in my office. I've been studying your techniques for years." The crowd erupted in excited whispers and gasps as people began to understand what they had just witnessed. They hadn't been watching an inexperienced volunteer being picked on by a bully. They had been watching one of the greatest Jiu-Jitsu masters of all time demonstrate her incredible skills. Marcus's face went through several different expressions as he processed this information. First came shock as he realized who he had been trying to grab. Then embarrassment as he thought about all the condescending things he had said to her. Finally, deep respect as he understood the incredible honor of having been in a demonstration with such a legendary figure. "I am so sorry for how I acted," Marcus said, bowing deeply toward Maria. "I had no idea who you were. That was the most incredible demonstration of technique I have ever experienced. You controlled me completely, and I never felt threatened or in danger. I just felt guided." Maria accepted his apology with grace and humility. "There is no need to apologize," she said warmly. "You couldn't have known who I was, and you were just trying to put on a good show for these people. Besides, this was exactly the kind of demonstration I hoped we could do together." The audience began to applaud, but this was completely different from the loud, excited clapping that Marcus had received earlier. This applause was respectful and amazed, the kind of recognition given to someone who has just demonstrated true mastery of their craft. Maria turned to address the crowd directly, her voice carrying easily through the gymnasium without needing to be loud or forceful. "Jiu-Jitsu is not about being big or strong or intimidating people," she explained. "It's about understanding leverage, timing, and using technique to overcome size and power. When you really understand the principles, you don't need to fight against force. You can redirect it and use it for your own purposes." She gestured toward Marcus, who was listening intently to every word she said. "This gentleman is much bigger and stronger than I am, and he's also a skilled fighter with years of training. But size and muscles don't matter as much as people think they do when you understand how leverage and balance really work." An older man in the front row raised his hand and asked, "But how did you make him stumble and lose his balance without doing anything that looked forceful or aggressive?" Maria smiled at the question. "I wasn't fighting against his strength," she explained. "I was working with his momentum and energy. When he moved forward, I helped guide that movement in the direction it wanted to go anyway. When he tried to change direction, I made small adjustments that encouraged his body to keep moving the way it was already moving." A teenage girl near the middle of the crowd asked, "Did you plan this demonstration ahead of time?" "Not at all," Maria replied honestly. "I came here today just to watch and enjoy seeing young people learn about martial arts. When this gentleman invited me to participate, I thought it would be a good opportunity to show people that Jiu-Jitsu is about technique and knowledge, not about being the biggest or strongest person in the room." Marcus stepped forward and addressed the crowd himself. "I want everyone here to understand what just happened," he said. "I used all of my size, strength, and speed, trying to complete what should have been a simple demonstration. Maria used nothing but perfect technique and timing. She never struck me, never hurt me, never even made me feel like I was in danger. But she had complete control over every single thing that happened between us." He turned back to Maria with genuine admiration. "That was the most educational experience I've ever had in martial arts. I learned more about fighting in those few minutes than I have in months of regular training." Maria bowed respectfully to Marcus, then to Coach Thompson, and finally to the entire audience. "Thank you all for giving me the chance to share this with you today," she said. "Remember that true strength doesn't come from your muscles or your size. It comes from understanding, patience, and years of dedicated practice." As Maria walked toward the edge of the mat, the entire crowd stood up and gave her a standing ovation. The applause went on for several minutes as people showed their appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Several martial arts students approached Maria as she prepared to leave, asking for autographs and requesting permission to take photos with her. She was gracious with everyone, taking time to speak personally with young students and answer questions about her training and career. Coach Thompson announced that the academy would be honored to have Maria return anytime she wanted to teach seminars or work with their advanced students. Marcus asked if he could schedule private lessons with her, saying he wanted to completely rebuild his understanding of martial arts based on what she had shown him. As Maria finally prepared to leave the gymnasium that day, she had transformed from an unassuming woman who was mocked and dismissed into a living legend, who had reminded everyone present about the true meaning of martial arts mastery. Her demonstration without a single aggressive move had been more powerful and educational than any violent display could ever have been.